We're going to turn to our next session, which is going to really talk about how we slay those monsters. This is where the dragons come back in. That's the theme for the Cyber Summit, is dragons. How can the cybersecurity industry address the systemic risks that we've been talking about? Please welcome to the stage Anh Quy, the CEO of Red Balloon Security, Sam King, the CEO of Veracode, and Wael Mohamed, the CEO of Forescout. Moderating this discussion is Michael Daniel, founder and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Vivian, for that introduction. And I think we've had a great talk by Jen Easterly with Kelly Boren this morning, and the previous panel talking about the nature of systemic risk and how it has evolved and what it's like. And I think from our purposes, this panel, we're going to focus on what the cybersecurity industry can and should be doing about systemic risk. But first, let me just kind of open with a question about how do you think about systemic risk, and importantly, why should organizational leaders, maybe those who aren't even in charge of giant pieces of the infrastructure, why should they care about this topic of systemic risk? So,
do you want to go, Sam?
Sure, I'll jump in here. So the way I think about systemic risk actually resonates quite a bit with what the previous panel was talking about. But from an organizational perspective, I think the biggest shift that I've seen is historically, we've talked about protecting our critical assets. And a lot of times, organizations will identify what are the applications or systems that are really critical. And I think when you think about this problem space through the lens of systemic risk, you realize that there's really only one asset that is critical, and that is the mission of whatever your organization is setting out to do. And increasingly, that mission is dependent on other parties. So when you think about getting speed and agility in your business, you automatically think about driving digital transformation. And the last 18 months in particular have hastened digital transformation at a pace that I think was unimaginable prior to this. People that were sitting on the fence and saying, our business is not ready, our users are not ready, our patients are not ready, our students are not ready, got ready overnight. And a lot of that adoption of new technology, hastening of digital transformation, oftentimes was conducted by making use of third-party service providers, by making use of third-party software, open source code, commercial code, et cetera. So when you think about this problem from the standpoint of systemic risk, you realize that the critical asset is the mission of your business. That mission is being fueled by digital transformation, and digital transformation, in turn, is being fueled by this great reliance and dependency on all of these service providers, which makes good business sense. It helps you go faster, but it introduces that risk into your system. And I think the reason why leaders and organizations, even those that don't have responsibility for the infrastructure or even security, the reason why they should care about this is that when they look forward, their ability to drive the business results and their ability to manage risk for their business is increasingly dependent on this environment and the broader ecosystem.
Yeah.
All right, I have some thoughts on systemic risk on the commercial side, but also, for the U.S. government within defense. And I'll preface this by saying, I've spent the last 15 years of my life thinking about security for computers that pretty much no one wants to think about, and those are the ones that you don't see, right? The little embedded computers that run all of the critical infrastructure. Actually, this is a great room, right? If I asked everyone to draw on a piece of paper what you think a fault protection relay in a substation looks like, I think we're going to get at least a dozen different, things, right? So I was coming up, so we drove from Denver to Aspen, great trip yesterday, like 11 o'clock at night. And I was thinking about this. We're talking about how innovation can solve or help, make systemic risk go away. And I started thinking, well, you know what? Innovation, by definition, actually generates systemic risk, because one of the things that, during innovation, what you do is you take a thing that might not be possible, right, and you create a thing that's functional, but you, by necessity, have to hopefully, ignore some of the externalities, right? And then the next iteration of innovation will come in and say, ooh, how do we solve those externalities to make things a little bit better? And that innovation creates more externalities. And I think a good example of that, way back, we're not just talking about, cybersecurity. I was talking to Mohamed, my colleague, in the car. Does anybody remember this thing called Operation Plowshare? Show of hands, anyone? So this was like in the 1960s, right? I think we had two problems. And it was right around here in the Rockies and Santa Fe, New Mexico. The two problems were we had too many mountains and we had too many nuclear weapons that we didn't know what to do with. So Operation Plowshare was this series of innovative experiments to see if we can use one to solve the other by blowing up large chunks of the mountain. We also, I think at some point, wanted to create the Pan-Atomic Canal by just blowing up the Panama Canal and expanding it. Right? So that's innovation, right? The externality is that, we knew that there was going to be some radioactivity that's going to be left in the land, but that's one of those externalities, right? The next round of innovators would come in and solve. And I think we see that. I mean, that's the thing that I see in innovation in cybersecurity, both for defensive capability, right, for all these things, and also by definition, offensive capabilities too. And to make things worse, right, radioactivity, nuclear fallout is not an intelligent adversary. Right? It just does radio decay. So if you put the adversary, like an intelligent adversary, into this mix, who also innovates, right, potentially against you, then I see that, there's no way to not innovate, but by going forward, we're necessarily increasing, accelerating both, right, the problem and the solution, and it's really interesting to think about. I don't know if that's kind of a bummer for this early in the morning, but that was my thought coming up here.
From my perspective is basically, I heard it in the previous panel, Wendell mentioned about not only your customers, but your customers' customers and your customers' customers' customers. And long time ago, we used to talk about basically how the perimeter is disappearing. Today, it disappeared. As a matter of fact, now in the time of COVID, we're all working from home, and it's real. I do still remember how I started my first company, and I was standing in the lineup to actually pay for my grocery, and then the cashier said, "You know what? At only cash, we cannot really take any credit or any plastic." And I said, "Okay, I'll go to the ATM in the machine and put my card," and it still did not really work. And then I had to leave my grocery, and I realized there was something wrong with the system. And as I get my car and I was low on gas, I stopped the fuel, and thanks God, actually the card worked. But at that moment, I still remember, I said, you know what? That server that actually, it was a kill chain. It was a bank that basically had a problem with their firewall, and a part of the kill chain was very dramatic. They actually stopped the system. So all their customers were affected. And I said, you know what, that server needs to be able to protect itself. Doesn't matter where it lives. If it's living in this parking lot, it should be able to protect itself. And that was actually at a beginning of reimagining how it's gonna work. And that's what innovation is all about. When I started, it was like maybe 100 companies basically tried to be able to solve problems. Today, there's thousands. When I started, there was not a lot of resources, there was not a lot of money. You had to go and talk to a lot of VCs to convince them that cybersecurity is important. Today, there's funds that are dedicated only to cybersecurity. So I want to bring some positive into this. I do believe we have incredible amount of innovation in our space. Every single day, I talk to new entrepreneurs with ideas to solving problems we as a large companies do not see. And that's the beauty about basically innovation, is to reimagine things that we don't see or think even is important today. And that's the only way we can get ahead, because the bad guys are cooperating and collaborating and basically sharing. And they're learning and investigating what we have. And you mentioned earlier, we were talking outside about how the information is available to everybody. And we as an industry need to actually embrace that innovation and basically continue with it. But I do believe we made huge progress in the last 30 years I've been in the industry. Now we know what cybersecurity is, we understand the risk, we understand it's not inside our walls. Now even our own employees that working from home bringing a completely new set of risks that was not as visible 2 years ago. Now it's visible. We're talking about privacy, and you have no idea when you're talking on Zoom what's listening, what basically microphone is on. You have smart everything in your house. And now your house is part of your enterprise. So it's incredible, basically new setting. I do believe cybersecurity, it is like the brakes on the car. It's not invented to make cars go slower. it made cars to go faster. Can you imagine if you're driving on the highway 100 miles an hour without no brakes? You can't. So we as cybersecurity leaders, we need to figure ways in how to actually do exactly what you said, allow organization to drive growth and digitize and take a full advantage of what we have, but in a safe manner. And the only way for that is we need to understand the risk and be able to mitigate it in various ways, whether that to do with your basically how you write code, whether that basically understanding some of the vulnerability in your hidden system, and whether that basically to be able to segment certain assets so it will not be as exposed. There's many, many ways to be able to do that, and I think our industry have a lot of leaders, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, so actually I want to build on that point, Wael. The security industry, as you noted, it's notoriously fractured, right? I mean, if you go to any sort of large cybersecurity conference like, RSA or something like that, I mean, there are thousands of security vendors there. And it's a very intensely competitive industry. In fact, it's nice that all of you are sitting on stage being so nice to each other, and we appreciate that. But how does this, this structure, this very diversified, fractured nature of the cybersecurity industry, how does that affect the industry's ability to identify and address systemic risk? Especially since if you think about most companies start out being, they're designed to solve a problem. Right? There's a cybersecurity problem, and they build a widget or a process or a thing to solve that problem. How should we think about that? Maybe we can start with you.
So here's a thought. Well, maybe another way to think about this problem is if you look at the number of dollars or cybersecurity companies that are, built and operating to solve the problems that they solve, right? And you put that on a histogram or some sort of a heat map. Does that mean that those things that are hot are the biggest security problems that we should address, right? And I personally don't think so, and I think there are plenty of reasons why that is. I think it is true. Lots of security companies out there, lots of competition. I think there's certainly some risks that probably have an overabundance of solutions and commercial companies that can help and make those products. And I think there's certainly some of the more critical infrastructure, things that, in my mind represents one of the larger sort of cyber systemic risks that, is really interestingly, underserved. And this is what I did my PhD on at Columbia, and this is kind of what my company does to address. I think there's a really interesting dynamic. Maybe we can, if we have time, let's come back to, right? For example, the devices, that make up the critical infrastructure, right? Do the people that operate and use those devices, right, have any impact on how secure that device is? And if there's a compromise, who pays, right? Does the manufacturer who makes this thing pay money, or is it all on, let's say, the operator? And one of my analogies is, and I know Windows here, all right? So I would say, so close your eyes. Imagine, you want to run a utility, right? You make power, you have a hydro dam, and the world says, okay, the computer that controls all of your valves and things that can catch on fire and explode and take power out, okay, the best on the market is you buy a Windows XP pre-patched laptop, okay? You can't open it up, you can't look at the code, you can't install anything, you connect it to your network and you automate all this stuff, right? And you have to have an audit process, and if, and that's how you can't, reverse engineer the thing. You can't get Microsoft to do anything, and Windows not around, so no service pack 1, right? Pre-patch. And then, lo and behold, right, like the utility gets compromised because, in 2021, if you're running Windows unpatched XP laptop, you're gonna get owned in like half a minute. And then what happens is the utility has the responsibility of doing all of the forensic information, the cleanup, and the reporting, right? While the manufacturer that made the Windows XP laptop keeps on making Windows XP things. And when I've surveyed the different devices that run these critical infrastructures, yeah, I would say some verticals are different, but certainly in power and industrial control, I would say the average security posture for the code inside those things is like circa 2001 to 2005. So I think the big question is, well, why do we have that dynamic? And I think if we can solve that dynamic, we can really kind of get to the heart of addressing that thread, right?
Yeah, so Sam?
So first thing I'll say is thank you for acknowledging us being really nice to each other, despite the fact that we compete in the cybersecurity market. I would say that being competitive and being civil are not mutually exclusive. So I think we can all do that. So I've been in the security industry for over 20 years at this point in time, and there has absolutely been an immense explosion of service providers in this space and an immense expansion of the understanding of what we do. You know, when I first started, my parents didn't quite understand what I do for a living. Then they got to a point where they were really proud of what I did for a living. And lately, they're at a point where they're looking at me and saying, are you really good at your job or not? Because it's like,
I've gotten the same question.
What are you guys doing, right? And I said, I don't know, I'm going to the Aspen Cybersecurity Summit and I'll come back and report to you. So, you know, here's how I would talk about the characteristics of the security market. It is intensely competitive, and there is some positive that comes from it, and there's some risk that gets created as a result of that. The positive that comes from it is that you cannot be complacent as a service provider. The people whose needs we are serving are thoughtful, discerning, technical buyers that really care about solving the cybersecurity problem for their organization, right? And with the intense competition that exists, you constantly have to be on your toes. You have to be continually innovating. You cannot stand still, because if you do, then someone else is going to come in. The cycle with which the next generation of the next generation of the next generation technology comes out is really shrinking. So from that perspective, competition is a good thing because it keeps us all very motivated to continually innovate. And to try to address the problem in such a way that you're not just providing a feature or a capability to, you know, solve some very narrow aspect of the problem, that you're really trying to get at the business value associated with the cybersecurity problem that you're tackling. So I think that's one of the positives that comes from this. I also think that because of the relatively easy and tremendous access to capital, there's this equalizing of the playing field between the large players and the smaller players. You can have a startup that has a brilliant idea. Perhaps it's getting at systemic risk, perhaps it's getting at a particular very specific problem, but either ways, they can get access to capital, they can go spin up their technology inside a cloud service provider, and next thing you know, they're competing with a very large organization. So that equalizing of the playing field, I think, also keeps us all thinking about how do you solve this problem in a better, more holistic way. Now, some of the negative that can come from that is that sometimes in this need to constantly differentiate and to have your message be heard above the noise that exists in the sector, you may chase after some bells and whistles, some features that look really cool, but when you're really thinking about the broad landscape of the business problem that somebody is dealing with, maybe you're not going to have that much of an impact. And I think that is where I will channel what Director Easterly was talking about in her opening remarks. That's where the partnership aspect between those of us that are service providers in this industry and those that are trying to solve the cybersecurity problem at the front lines inside organizations, whether they be in the public sector or the private sector, comes into the picture. Because if we are held accountable to not producing the coolest feature, but if we're held accountable to how are we actually helping them reduce the risk, prevent, or those of us that are on the detect response side do that in a better, more holistic way, then that helps raise the game for everybody.
I totally agree. I believe, look, the real competition here is the bad guys, and that's the reality. Yes, we can be able to compete or co-compete basically on some projects or trying to be able to win. We're in the end of the day in business of actually doing business and adding value to our customers, and can be able to take that value that we add and we can reinvest and innovate and so forth. But new companies always keep us on our toes because they always look at something that is very, very small. Maybe it's not in our radar because of our size, of our basic priorities, and they can be able to reimagine something that will become important tomorrow. I believe innovation is about time, and bigger companies have resources, have money, but the only thing we don't have is time, especially in our space. Like, if you are in a hardware space, you have a different cycle than a software space. In a cybersecurity space, we're dealing in the seconds. And we always have to react. And when you always have to react, you basically, you have to have a different DNA. And I do believe there is always going to be room for innovation. When I have one of my customers, because there is no silver bullets, and when you go to the customer, any one of us, do not go to the customer and say, by the way, I can solve all your problems. That's not true. This is what I can solve very well. This is what I'm very good at, and basically, and be able to provide that. And we know we have to be able to work together. And when the customer is down, we forget we're competing. We basically have to figure out how to bring this customer up. And in my industry for many years, we always picked up the phone and called to each other and said, hey, this customer is down, how we can be able to collaborate. Organization like yourself is actually encourage us to have a platform for sharing. It's important. As you mentioned, information becoming stale very quickly. In the old days, if you have something that is basically of importance and you hold it for a month, you feel that you have something valuable. Now it's like 24 hours, it's already been known. So how to deal with that? One of the things that actually wake me up at night is the stealth attacks. We hear all the stuff in the news. By the time you hear about it, it's basically either it's not sophisticated or it's already happened. But good thieves do not break a window, do not leave any things on the carpet. They do not tell you that you are actually in the house. You are in and out. And there is basically those attacks that you are already in, and we don't know for months. You know what I mean? It's extremely dangerous. One of the things we've done better than a lot of other countries is disclosures. Like we hear a lot of attacks happening because we have an obligation to disclose, and we have really perfected how we can be able to deal with that and strike this balance between how you disclose and not basically providing the information to the bad guys. But there is a lot of countries that are behind that. And I can assure you, there's tons of attacks happening that we see every day that is basically in a lot of places around the world that it's not disclosed. And disclosure is very important because that's how you can be able to mitigate the risk. If the bad guys know that they're gonna get caught and their techniques has been basically been captured, and we understand it, and we can have the right IOCs and can be able to do the sharing, we can close that window. There's tons we need to be able to do, but I'm very optimistic that we're getting way better in basically perfecting the disclosures.
Yeah, it's great.
Well,
No, go ahead.
I have a thing. It's very optimistic. So I like it. So, you know, in response to the thing you said about, you know, the bad guys are our biggest problems. You know, well, that's probably true, right? But if we look at not just the cybersecurity industry, let's just think about tech industry as a whole. I think the tech industry is the tech industry's biggest systemic risk. And I'll give you an example, right? In two directions. So, you know, the more obvious one is we love making new things with, frivolous, functionality, right? Or maybe, in retrospect, not the most prudent things to put on things. And I was
Cat filters, perhaps?
Cat filters are, I think, good for the world. It'll be probably, that's the thing that's going to save democracy. But, right, so one example, I was looking at a brand new fault protection relay, right, and these are the things that is the first line of defense for, substation power grid. If there's a line down, overcurrent, right, this thing is a computer that disconnects so power lines don't burn and, things don't catch on fire. Right? And I'm sure we've all heard, the first thing we should do, right, is enforce air gap in this network. And everybody says, like, air gap is the first thing you got to do. And this is a brand new 2021 product. And they say that in the manual, but on the side of the physical box, they have a Google Play and an Apple App Store logo. And I said, what does that mean? And you scan the QR code. The thing is, you can control it, right, from your iPhone. And this is not like a commercial, right, fault protection relay. I mean, no, this is the thing that actually is about to get rolled into our critical infrastructure right now. So in this case, right, tech industry loves to put all of this new ways of access, and a lot of times I think we kind of run before we really think about whether we should, the whole run fast and break things, cool for Facebook, right, but maybe not the greatest for critical infrastructure things. And the bad guys, sure, they're there. Their job is to take advantage of the vulnerabilities of the things that we build. So so that's one part of it. And the other part, simultaneously, right, the tech industry also has a way of not getting rid of the really old legacy things. So we're suffering from both problems at the same time. It's almost paradoxical, but right, we have too many things that are way too old, that have no security, and we keep on building really new things that have all sorts of connectivity and very little security. So, yeah.
But I think this actually raises an interesting point that really has struck me over the years as I have been involved with cybersecurity, that so much of the challenges that we're talking about here are as much about the economics of the problem as they are about the technology of the problem. So why do we have all of those legacy systems still hanging around? That's about economics, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's more economical in many ways to keep those systems around, right? Why don't companies patch when they know that they should? I mean, it's not because they're stupid, right? It's because it just doesn't make it up on the mission priority list, right? It's about the economics. And even when, Window was talking about the economics of the devices, right, on the previous panel, right? Why are the devices run that slim with as few protections put in? It's as much about economics as it is about the technology. And so I'm really interested in your thinking about sort of how the economics of the network effects, right, of there's an advantage to having everybody on the same platform or using the same, software, right? That's, there's an advantage to that. But that creates a single point of failure. It helps create this systemic risk. And so how should we think about the economics of this, particularly, like the security, from the security industry's point of view? How should we think about the economics of that, and how does that affect what solutions are available for managing systemic risk? Well, we can start with you.
Absolutely, a great point, and just to kind of comment on the optimism about where we are, and your point of introducing a lot of risk because of the innovation on the technology side. I think there is a little bit of balance. I believe the economics is actually moving in the right direction. So let me give you an example. Many years ago, the CFO will basically say, you need to have basically a business case why you need to have a virtual machine because our standard is physical. And then a few years later, they changed their mind and they said, look, if you don't put it in a virtual machine, because they realize it's safer and economically actually prudent, you need to give me a reason why you still need to have a physical server. And then now, if you actually do not use cloud, they can basically have to make a justification why you need to basically have a different architecture. So the infrastructure change has moving extremely fast. It's more cost effective than forcing all this legacy to be able to move forward. And at a pace that it never happened before. So as a security leaders, we need to be able to realize the world is changing. And there's many changes. First, the infrastructure change. When I started my company, I thought I was going to do server security, and then it became virtual security, and then became cloud security, and now we're saying serviceless. Can you imagine? When I sat down at my kitchen table building my business plan, there was no imagination to reimagine a serverless. You know what I mean? And now we're talking about DevOps and the speed and how to be able to develop. But there's always user behavior risk. Now, when people are going to come back to basically post-COVID, there's a new hybrid world when working from home is a reality. There's a huge organization were designed, you have to be from the inside. And now you need to be able to figure out this new behavior, and we need to adjust to that. And it's happening at the pace that we would never anticipate. It would probably, if it was not for COVID, would have taken us 15 years. Now we're going to take us months, and you saw how many organizations spun out their organization very quickly. The third and the most difficult thing for us is the change of the motivation of the hackers. And a ransomware is not a new thing. It existed. But they used to go to your PC and capture some pictures and try to be able to say, can you pay me this so I can give you your information back? And now they can be able to go to a pipeline and it can turn on very mission-critical systems. It's an old techniques. It's just basically used in a new way. So to go back to you, I think the economics work into our advantage. And you'll find that we're going to be moving to the new system faster. And we, as an industry, we need to accept that. We need to accept that it's cheaper to move to the new system. But here's a big risk. I cannot buy anything that's not smart. I cannot buy an old TV. I cannot buy an old fridge, whether I like it or not. And now I need to know in a hospital system, if this fridge is from my lunch or it's for the blood. And the risk is totally different. And now I need to look at it as not just a fridge. You know what I mean? What it does and where it is and how it's going to be sitting in the network and how I'm going to deal with it. And this is things we're going to need to completely revisit the way we actually look at risk. not only internally and externally, but even internally. And I heard in the previous panel talking about as simple as a printer. You know what I mean? A printer is a mission critical system because it actually takes a huge amount of data that you can send. You can send a contract, you can send very confidential information. And a simple hijacking of that printer that it looks like a very low-level device can become very, very dangerous. Or a camera, or a thermometer, and it's just a new world. So economically, I think things are improving because it's getting cheaper. It adds more challenge on us because we need to really innovate faster. But here's the beauty. As I hear you talk, I'm very proud of our industry to be able to attract that smart people to our industry, to be able to think about these problems. And there's tons of problems to be solved. And our competition, the bad guys, they come from a different education backgrounds. Diversity is going to be very important. Our #1 challenge right now is talent. How we can be able to draw a diverse talent. We have huge shortage. And we need to figure out how we can be able to attract them and make them on the right side. There is a lot of money to be made on the wrong side.
Yep.
And I think the partnership between government and industry is going to be a big, big factor of that.
Okay. Yeah, Sam.
So I think there's a lot embedded within this question around the economics as they relate to the network effects of using certain service providers or software platforms and so forth. Let me try to address it from a few different perspectives. So first of all, I think the question of economics lands very differently when you're talking about the economics from the attacker perspective versus the economics from the defender perspective, right? For attackers, relatively low cost, very high returns, very high profitable, big business, right? From the defender's point of view, with respect to continued use of old technologies, and I think it is a great point that you made about we see simultaneously tremendous use of old and tremendous adoption of new, and then probably everything in between, right? So we don't all move consistently to the new, so you have these vulnerabilities that were present in old systems that are latent, and then as digital transformation has been occurring and systems have been getting connected at a faster pace, now that vulnerability is no longer latent, right? Someone can take advantage of that. But when you think about the economics, you can certainly talk about how, it's cheaper for me to just stay with the old and not go to the new till that's no longer true. But because all of a sudden, on a particular day, you can't find the talent to keep up the old stuff, speaking to your point, Wael, it becomes more expensive to make changes on the old stuff. A lot of the migration to the cloud, a lot of digital transformation, you hear people talking about taking their monolith and either breaking it apart into microservices, or sometimes because they don't want to undertake that effort because they think it might be too expensive, they're taking the monolith and migrating the monoliths to the cloud and then building cloud services around it. But you're carrying some of that cost and you're carrying some of that technical debt with you. It also behooves us to look at some aspects of the economics that have been known for quite some time, but taking better action on them. So I think NIST has published this data forever, which is it is 30 times more expensive to fix a problem once that application system gets in production versus doing it when you're actually developing it. So if you know that, then why do you not do it while you're developing it? That's where the time pressures of getting new functionality to the market come into the picture, right? Because if you're a business, you got two problems: growth and all the other problems, right? And how you're going to drive growth is you're going to drive growth by creating new experiences, by attracting your customers, whoever they may be, to your products and offerings versus your competitors. Increasingly, you're going to do that by creating these new, amazing, sticky digital experiences. You're going to do that by getting great functionality out to market sooner, right? So then that's where you get this juxtaposition of speed to market, driving revenue, building it more securely, doing it right. I know it's cheaper to do it right here than doing it later, but I might rush and get code out, which a lot of people actually say that they will oftentimes ship code with vulnerabilities present in it, right? So I think those are the factors that we have to take into consideration. And there have been some moves within technology, talking to, holding technology accountable to creating secure technology. DevOps is a movement that's changing up how software development gets done. DevOps very quickly turned into DevSecOps, and I would argue that in doing so, took into account that economic model, if it's cheaper to fix it sooner than doing it later. So there are opportunities present, too, in this migration from the old to the new.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that strikes me is that this is also a space then that the government has to think about how it might want to be involved and shape the market, right? And are there ways that it can help address some of that, first to market wins, second to market dead, right? So that, there's pressure to not deal with the security questions, right? And there are places where we might want to say, we actually want to slow that down as a society. As a digital ecosystem, we want to actually slow that down a little bit to give us the time to think these things through and to bake in the security from the beginning. Ang, I'll turn to you in just 1 second on this question, but we were talking previously about how this affects the federal government too. Many people complain about the old technology you see in the federal government, but that's not because the federal government is just bureaucratic and slow entirely. It is incredibly easier to get money from Congress to keep old systems running than it is to get money to buy new systems. So if you're a federal manager, or if you're an expert, or someone in the federal government responsible for running an IT system, it is eminently practical and logical to keep the old system running because you can get money for that, and you cannot get money to buy a new thing. So of course that's what you're going to do. So I think that's, those economic and structural issues are ones that's very important for the security industry to think about as we look to how we shape innovation to deal with the systemic risk problems. But Ang, I'll let you sort of weigh in on some of these.
Man, lots of things to say. So the first thing is, one, on the optimism thing, I think for security people, fundamentally, we have to simultaneously be a pessimist because we think there are problems that needs to be fixed, and optimist because we think we might be able to actually fix some of these problems. And in terms of the network effect, right, and having mass adoption of a single system, does that actually improve security, make security worse? I think all of the things we've been saying here largely applies, I think, to general purpose computing, right? If you want to do a cloud, right, you can do a lot of really good things to improve security across the board. Looking at critical infrastructure things, though, I think the dynamics are very much different. You don't have the same dynamic where you can just replace all of your Cisco routers on the internet, right? You can't switch out, every fault protection relay. I'm sure people would like to sell you new fault protection relays, but I'm here to say I would put a whole lot of money on that will never really happen, right? We're going to be living in this, perpetual legacy security problem forever, or just going forward, unless it all burns down and we have to rebuild again, which won't happen. And in terms of the security versus the mass adoption or network effect thing, I do think that that's actually a false choice, or that's not a real connection, at least in critical infrastructure things, because number one, right? It's not true that if you have the same device, that device can't use technology to intentionally have diversity and actually prevent exploitation of it, right? You can have one lineage of technology that actually is more secure than 50 different ones. And in this country, if you look at critical infrastructure, we already have the network effect, right? So if you look inside, let's say any power station, right? There's one vendor that roughly has what, like 75% of this country's power distribution market. And if you look at PLCs, not that many companies make PLCs, right? There's effectively 3 or 4 major players. The players shift from the U.S. to the rest of the world. But yeah, we have very few major players that have these entrenched products that don't change very much, and sometimes they change a lot by putting a Bluetooth chip on, and you really have to ask why. And yeah, so finally, in terms of the economics of the security, right? Like how to change security for critical infrastructure, I would say I do see that fundamentally there's a misalignment on incentive between the people who manufacture devices that go into critical infrastructure, right, and how much security they built in, and the incentive of the market demanding additional security, because again, the people who make this stuff do not actually have to pay very much when the operators are compromised with the products, right, that they make, because the operators have to pay for the cleanup. And I think if we can address that misalignment of incentive, then we can really get at the heart of that problem. But we're not really going to be able to until we start really looking at that policy end.
Excellent. So we've got about slightly less than 5 minutes left in the discussion, and so I'm going to end with this question on what's one action an organizational leader could take in the short term to try to better safeguard themselves against the systemic risk that we've been talking about this morning. So Sam, why don't we start with you?
So I think it starts with visibility, right? If you are a single organization, you are dependent on technologies, you're dependent on software and code, some of which you've written, some of which you're getting from third parties. I think asking your organization to first and foremost have an understanding of what do we use? What versions of things do we use? Where do we have some concentrated risk because we're using a third-party supplier, perhaps for multiple business units or what have you? That visibility starts to create the ability to take action. It starts to create better vigilance around what new vulnerabilities have been discovered with these technologies that we're using. And if you know where you're using them, then you can immediately shift your effort and attention to reacting to that and patching it versus going out and figuring out where am I using that version of OpenSSL when Heartbleed came out as an example, right? So much of the energy at first was just spent on discovering. So I think if we can create visibility around what is it that we're using, and then this is where, going to your previous question around the role of the federal government, this is where aggregating some of that information in an anonymized fashion across multiple organizations can start to give you a sense for where's their concentrated risk when you think about the ecosystem more broadly, right? And so I think if there's one area that I would ask people to focus their attention on, it is getting visibility into what you are using. And we have published a report called the State of Software Security Report, where we provide visibility into the use of open source. What open source is most prevalent? Which one is on the rise? Which is on the decline? So also making use of those kinds of sources to get smarter on what you have so that you're in a better position to defend and to respond when new vulnerabilities or new issues invariably arise.
Excellent. On?
Man,
one thing they
okay,
can do.
one thing. Okay, I would say I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, again, critical infrastructure things. So if you're a user of these devices, you run some type of critical infrastructure, be it in government or in the commercial space. I would say very much like what you said. Knowing what's bad in the firmware of the things, right, is step number one. And I think software, SBOM, good idea. It's just the start. But if you don't have, the real no BS answer to what is actually in the firmware and how bad the security is or how good it is, you can't really start making decisions on, well, which PLC is actually more secure than the other. And then, on the same, in that same sentence, I'll say, once you have that information, go and complain, right? Complain to, the federal regulators, go and complain to the device manufacturers. And, we need to start, holding those folks' feet to the fire to say, it's probably not okay to ship an operating system you compiled back in 2005 in a product you're selling in 2021, right? But you can't say that unless you actually know that fact. So find out some facts and go complain.
An SBOM, a very good acronym, software bill of materials, just to unpack that a little bit. But I agree. And Wael, we'll give you the last word here.
I do agree. Visibility is very important. You cannot really protect what you don't really know, and you need to understanding, and SBOM will be definitely very important, so you can be able to know if this component is really, do you have it or not, and if you do have it, what are you going to do about it? If I have one thing to be able to as an advice to any customer, I always say, ask yourself a question: are you currently under attack or not? And if you are, do you have all the right mechanisms so you can be able to react? And if you're not, do you really know exactly how you're going to be able to deal with it when you do? I remember one industry colleague told me when their peer, another competitive basically organization, got hacked, his CEO called him and he says, why we're not hacked? Because he said, look, let me assume that basically we're not better than them. And if they got attacked, then we could be attacked. I need to understand where we stand. And that's going back to visibility. And I think the most important thing as an industry leaders, to be able to provide visibility. How can I show you where you are, where you stand? And then best action, you can be able to do that economically.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the great discussion this morning.